Muted.
Today from TEA are Lori Ayers, the presenter, that's me, Tim Miller, Mike Versinga, Mixon Henry, and Vanessa Alba. Please feel free to write in your questions as we go. We will pause periodically to answer some of your questions. We will schedule another webinar in the near future that will be only a question and answer session. This will allow attendees to process information presented today, apply it to their unique needs, and then seek clarification at the question and answer webinar. We will also create an FAQ with the questions you submit today and as a follow-up. Please note as we go through this presentation, we assume our audience is mostly EPP staff. So when the presenter refers to you or your, this is intended to refer to the EPP that the attendee represents. The training today will cover most of the rules affecting what we call the components, such as EPP governance, admission, curriculum, program design and delivery, program assessment, and issuance of certificates. We will mostly cover items in chapters 227, 228, and 230. The second training webinar that we will be offering will be scheduled for Monday, February 6th at 9:30 a.m. That one will address rule changes in Chapter 229. The focus will be on reporting changes in ASAP and accountability. There are many changes to Texas Administrative Code, which we will call TAC going forward, governing educator preparation and certification. This training attempts to provide an overview of many of the changes in TAC and is not comprehensive for the details of all changes. EPP staff should carefully review TAC to find additional detail regarding presented changes and to learn about other changes not presented in this training today. Additional information will also be posted on the EPP resources page. EPP questions after this date should first be directed to the assigned program specialist. If the program specialist cannot find an answer, then he or she will research and respond back to the EPP staff with an answer. To summarize this information, we are attempting to provide you with the major changes, but we cannot address all of the changes in this one webinar, so we expect you to read through the TAC and make sure you are aware of all of the changes and updates to your operating rules. We are always happy to assist you. If you don't know who to call, you should always start with your assigned program specialist. The program specialist assignment list is posted on the Program Provider Resources page on the TEA website. The 5 staff members listed under Tim's name on this slide report directly to him. We have varying responsibilities within the role of supporting the EPPs. To most efficiently address your needs, we recommend you start with one of the 3 program specialists at the bottom of the list and then work your way up from the bottom. If it's a Title II or accountability question, we'll likely send you to Mike. To give you a picture of the broad changes that have occurred in TAC this last year, these are the chapters that have had changes or updates. EPP staff members should have these rules bookmarked. If you don't already know how to access them, just go to the TEA website and on the drop-down menu created by the About TEA button, select SBEC Rules TAC under the Laws and Rules column. Then select Texas Administrative Code currently in effect. It is the responsibility of the education profession as a whole to attract applicants and to retain educators who demonstrate the knowledge and skills necessary to improve the performance of the diverse student population of this state. That's in Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 227. This rule is not a new rule. The citation is TAC Chapter 227.1a. It has been in TAC for a good bit of time, at least since 1999. It is placed on this slide to remind us of why we want to uphold higher standards in educator preparation. Collaboratively, TEA, VSBEC, schools, districts, and educator preparation programs can make this happen. Most of the admission requirements are found in Chapter 227. The majority of the amendments to this chapter were adopted to be implemented March 1st of 2016. The chapter was opened up again for some additional amendments to be implemented January 1st, 2017. As we go through, you may see items you have already implemented. This is because much of this chapter had already gone into effect during 2016. As we read through the following slides, you will see some implementation dates in red. If you have not implemented the items with past implementation dates, you should make those changes as soon as possible. Please note that all Chapter 227 rules are fully in effect for applicants admitted on or after January 1st, 2017. An important update in Chapter 227 is the clarification of the definitions of an applicant and a candidate. Please note as we go through this presentation that applicants are those people who are not yet in your program but are seeking admission. Candidates have already been admitted, and going forward, the EPP is responsible for providing coursework and training so that the candidate is effective in the classroom, which incidentally is another rule that resides in Chapter 228. Here are some additional definition changes that are important for admission. The new definitions of post-bac and ACP will impact the IHE or university-based programs. A candidate is a post-bac candidate if he or she is seeking a degree along with a certification in any class. An ACP candidate is seeking only a certificate and would already possess the required bachelor's or master's degree depending on the class of certificate sought. Distinguishing between post-bac and ACP will change the codes the EPPs use to recommend tests and certificates, and will change the codes TEA uses to add those certificates to the EPP inventory. If an accredited EPP wants to add an ACP or a post-bac route, the cost is $9,000, and the application must be reviewed by TEA staff and approved by the SBAC. If the EPP is approved for a post-bac and has already been certifying candidates in both routes, with degree and without, then the EPP would need to notify TEA by letter that you have been doing so, and we will recode the EPP to reflect approval for both routes. There will be no fee for this. A template letter for this purpose will be available shortly. Please also note that the term certification field to describe one of the possible teaching certificates that a candidate may earn has now been changed to certification category. This is important at admission because the admission rules require the EPP to admit an applicant in a certification category for which he or she meets the qualifications. Educator preparation programs should inform all applicants that, pursuant to the Texas Education Code, Chapter 22.083, candidates must undergo a criminal history background check prior to employment as an educator, and, pursuant to the TEC, Chapter 22.0835, candidates must undergo a criminal history background check prior to clinical teaching. The word should in this item means it's not required, but it would be a best practice to let your applicants know of the background check requirement before they're admitted and begin training, just in case there's something in the background that may prevent him or her from becoming certified in the future. This fits in directly with what's on the next slide, which says, inform your applicants, a person who is enrolled or planning to enroll in a state board for educator certification approved educator preparation program or planning to take a certification examination may request a preliminary criminal history evaluation letter regarding the person's potential ineligibility for certification due to a conviction or deferred adjudication for a felony or misdemeanor offense. It would also be a best practice to let your applicants know this information in case the applicant knows he or she has something in the background that might prevent certification. Consider placing this item, along with the information on the previous slide regarding the background check requirement, on your written application or on your admissions page on your website. According to TAC 227.1c, EPPs shall inform all applicants in writing of the following: the admission requirements as specified in this chapter, and the requirements for program completion as specified in Chapter 228 of this title, relating to educator preparation requirements. The shall in this item means it is a requirement. The best place for this information is on the admissions page on the EPP website. We have seen some EPPs post this information in the candidate handbook, which is fine for candidates. However, an applicant would not necessarily receive a candidate handbook that is issued to candidate after formal admission. Later on, you will see a new rule that requires the EPP to post a program timeline. If formatted correctly, that timeline could suffice for this rule as well. TAC 227.1c says EPPs shall inform all applicants in writing of the following: in accordance with Texas Education Code Chapter 21.044E3, the effect of supply and demand forces on the educator workforce in this state, and the performance over time of the EPP for the past 5 years. Again, this is a requirement and should be posted someplace accessible to applicants. Since this information could be used by applicants who are shopping for information about teaching careers and different kinds of EPPs, the EPP website would probably be an appropriate place for this information to be posted. This information needs to be factual, verifiable, and current. Some sources of this information could include EPP accountability, performance, and consumer information published on the TEA website, information regarding high-need teaching fields published on the TEA website, information published by reliable workforce sources, such as the Texas Workforce Commission, and specific verifiable EPP awards or accreditations. This rule has been updated. Some of this rule is new and some has been around for a few years. Before we look at the change in this rule, let's refresh our thinking about the GPA requirement for admission. The minimum GPA for admission into an EPP is 2.5. The GPA of an applicant may be calculated in one of two ways: either using the overall GPA identified on the official transcript, or using the last 60 hours of coursework. To calculate the last 60 hours, you would start with the most recent semester and work sequentially backward through the transcript. Now, let's go back to the rule. If the applicant does not meet the minimum 2.5 GPA and the EPP feels the applicant should be eligible for admission, this rule allows for up to 10% of the incoming class, which includes all classes of certificates, to be admitted with a GPA below the minimum. To qualify for the 10% exception, the applicant must have the following: there must be an extraordinary circumstance, the applicant must have the work experience equivalent of a GPA of 2.5, and the applicant must have a passing score on the content exam for the certification category in which he or she is seeking admission. The new portion of the rule adds the requirement that the applicant will have to have a passing score on a content exam. If your EPP plans to allow applicants to be admitted with a GPA below the minimum, it is recommended, but not required, that you develop a policy to apply these requirements equitably for all applicants. For undergraduate programs, the work experience equivalent may be difficult to establish. A brief reminder here, the EPP must now maintain an incoming class admission GPA average of 3.0 or higher, including all classes of certificates offered by that EPP. So for every applicant that is admitted with a GPA below 2.5, an EPP must admit an applicant with a GPA above 3.5. To meet the requirement for a passed content exam for classes other than teacher, the applicant must perform at or above a score equivalent to a 2.5 GPA on the verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, and analytic writing sections of the GRE, which is the Graduate Record Admission or Graduate Record Examination, revised general test. The State Board for Educator Certification will use equivalency scores established by the Educational Testing Service, and the Texas Education Agency will publish those equivalency scores annually on the TEA website. This rule was developed because there is no content test that is appropriate for an applicant to a non-teacher class to take prior to admission. A non-teacher class would be areas such as principal, school counselor, or educational diagnostician. This rule requires that an applicant with a GPA below the 2.5 minimum must take the GRE and meet the published equivalency scores. The scores will be published on the TEA website. Applicants must demonstrate basic skills. This is not a new rule. The process of determining basic skills has been aligned with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board requirements identified in Chapter 4 of TAC. Many of the TSI exemptions, such as identified scores on SAT or ACT exams, a conferred bachelor's degree, and others, are still acceptable demonstrations of basic skills. What has changed is that the TSI assessment is the only identified assessment. The THEA, the AccuPlacer, and others are no longer acceptable. The rule that an applicant must meet the English language proficiency requirement prior to admission is not new. This rule is also in place for certification in TAC Chapter 230. To demonstrate English language proficiency, TAC identifies three options. 1, earn a bachelor's degree or higher degree from an accredited university in the United States. 2, provide a letter from a university outside of the United States that says the primary language of instruction at that university is English. This means all coursework at that university is taught in English and not just the coursework completed by the applicant. Or 3, the applicant must take the TOEFL IBT and score a minimum of 26 on the speaking portion. We'll talk more about the TOEFL on the next slide. So the EPP must determine that the applicant has demonstrated the English language proficiency. What's new in this rule is in bullet numbers 1 and 3. Bullet 1 allows a traditional undergraduate program to use whatever the university uses as a demonstration of English language proficiency. Bullet 3 clarifies that out of country includes the territories, which means an applicant presenting a transcript from Puerto Rico will need to meet one of the 3 English language proficiency requirements, which could include taking the TOEFL. Speaking of TOEFL, let's take a closer look at that requirement. The TOEFL is an exam given internationally. There are no passing standards. There are identified levels of proficiency. The SBEC approved the exam and a proficiency standard in May of 2006. At that time, a committee was assembled to compare the existing test with the TOEFL and to identify a recommended proficiency score. The committee reported findings and recommendations to the SBEC. The SBEC voted unanimously in favor of adopting the TOEFL with the proficiency score of 26 as the acceptable demonstration of English language proficiency. Because we encourage EPPs to use official documents to make decisions, EPPs should require applicants to submit TOEFL scores through the EPP TOEFL code. Last year, we worked to get every EPP a TOEFL code for this purpose. TOEFL scores expire after 2 years, so it is strongly recommended that the EPP make a copy of the official scores to retain in the candidate record in order to fulfill records retention requirements. An applicant seeking admission to an EPP with a transcript from a country outside of the United States must have a foreign credential evaluation of that transcript prior to admission. This is not a new requirement. What is new here is the first bullet, which allows an EPP that is accredited by an accrediting organization recognized by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board to use its own foreign transcript review service if the EPP is in good standing with its accrediting organization. All other applicants must continue to use the approved transcript review providers. These may be found on the TEA website. Different questions come up from time to time regarding the reviewed transcripts received by the EPP. Here are some reminders based on those questions. Number 1, the overall GPA and course equivalence determined by the transcript review service should not be recalculated or changed by the EPP. And second, if there is no GPA identified by the transcript review service, the EPP should follow the admission requirements for applicants with a GPA of less than 2.5, which are the rules for the 10% exception. As I mentioned in the previous slide on admitting applicants with a GPA below the minimum of 2.5, EPPs are now held accountable for maintaining an incoming class GPA average of 3.0 or higher. An incoming class has been defined as all applicants admitted during a reporting year. The reporting year is September 1 through August 31. Using an example for the current reporting year, if an EPP is approved to certify teachers, principals, and superintendents, then the incoming class for that EPP is all teacher, principal, and superintendent candidates admitted from September 1, 2016 through August 31, 2017. For the purpose of calculating the GPA average of the incoming class, the EPP would not include teacher candidates seeking certification in CTE categories. On this slide, you can see that the formal admission requirement has been implemented since March of 2016. The implementation date of the TEA notification requirement is January 2017. To summarize the requirements now in effect, the EPP must extend a written offer of admission to the qualified applicant. That written offer must contain the official admission date within the contents of that offer. The applicant then accepts the offer of admission in writing. Once accepted in writing, the applicant will become a candidate on the formal admission date identified in the letter. Another update here is that the EPP must notify the TEA of each candidate's admission to the EPP within 7 calendar days of the date identified in the admission letter. The current way to notify the TEA of the candidate's admission into the EPP is through the test approval screen in ECOS. These next few slides are screenshots of that process. To upload a candidate as admitted, the EPP will need to go into the green screen to test approval and click on the arrow to get the drop-down menu for test approvals. Select the option to add test approval. Adding test approval may be completed either manually for each candidate or in a bulk upload using a CSV file. Please note that you are not actually giving approval to test. You will only be using the eligible designation at first. This is the screen the EPP will use to manually upload an admitted candidate's test approval. Note that in the date of admittance field, You will enter the formal admission date that was identified in the candidate's acceptance letter. This screen is also where you will enter the other information such as tests. It is acceptable to enter the exams that the candidate will be expected to take based on the certification category sought by that candidate, such as the content exam, any supplemental exams, and the PPR exam, and identify eligible for each of the exams. Due to a potential glitch, some EPPs have reported an error message when they try to get back at a later date and add another test approval with the same active date. So for this reason, it may be a good idea to upload all of the tests you know the candidate will take at one time and just list the candidate as eligible until ready to grant test approval for each test. If you happen to get this error message, you should be able to ignore it, and the system should accept the same admittance date again. If not, then please call TEA so that we can report it to our IT folks. Here is an example. A candidate's formal admission date was September 1st, 2015. The candidate was admitted seeking certification as a generalist EC6 with special education EC12. Knowing that, this EPP knew the candidate would be required to take test number 191 for the generalist EC6, test number 161 for the SPED EC12, and test number 160 for the PPR EC12 to be certified. This EPP uploaded all at one time and identified the status as eligible for each, changing that status to approved for one attempt as needed per EPP testing policy. Something to remember, please let your admitted candidates know they may receive an automated email from the system stating they've been uploaded for test approval, but that they are not really approved for the test yet. We are working with our IT staff to correct this problem. Here is the screen the EPP should see after the candidate is uploaded into test approval. This screen reflects the example I gave you on the previous slide. This is the screen that TEA staff see when we look candidates up in ECOS. If it becomes necessary, TEA and an EPP should be able to trace this active date back to the formal admission date in the signed acceptance letter that the EPP has retained in that candidate's records. Again, as we work through the implementation of the 7-day rule, please notify TEA if you are getting error messages or seeing other system glitches when attempting to upload your candidates using this process. We can't address or fix problems if we don't know about them. In TAC 227.17F, on formal admission for all applicants except contingency admission, postbac and ACPs are not allowed to provide coursework training and/or examination approval that leads to certification in any class prior to formal admission. A postbac or ACP program at an institution of higher education may admit an applicant if coursework and training was provided by the same IHE as part of a previous degree that was conferred. This was another rule that was implemented in March of 2016, then updated for a new implementation date of January of 2017. The update was the second bullet, which was necessary due to some confusion about candidates who completed an undergraduate degree and then attempted to enter the postbac or ACP program at that same university. A new rule this year involves the technology fee assessed on all admitted candidates. This will be in effect for those admitted on or after March 15th, 2017. The number of admitted candidates will be identified in September during ASEP reporting. The EPP will be invoiced based on the reported number of candidates admitted. This is based on admitted only. If a candidate is in a program for 2 years, the EPP will be assessed a $55 fee for that candidate only in the year he or she was admitted and not during the second year. If the candidate withdraws from the first EPP and transfers to a new EPP, the new EPP that admits that candidate will then be assessed a $55 fee for that candidate. Before we move out of Chapter 227 and into Chapter 228, let's answer some questions that were asked during the 227 presentation. If we do not get to all of your questions, we will answer them at the end of the presentation as time allows. If you don't get your questions answered today, please feel free to contact your program specialist or tune into the follow-up webinar for Q&A. We will also be posting answers to frequently asked questions on the EPP Providers Resources page. Okay, so here are some questions that we have seen come in. Can you please repeat the statement regarding updating ACP? Okay, rather than repeating the information at this time, we will be publishing a video of the presentation as well as the presentation with speaker notes after the webinar. Okay, another question. If offer of admission is via email, will the date of the email count as the admission date? The answer is yes, if the email message is clear that the formal admission date is the date that the email was sent. The candidate must accept the offer of admission, so we would not recommend setting the admission date as the date of the offer of admission. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next part of the presentation. To ensure the highest level of educator preparation and practice, the SBEC recognizes that the preparation of educators must be the joint responsibility of EPPs and the early childhood through grade 12 public and private schools of Texas. Collaboration in the development, delivery, and evaluation of educator preparation is required. This rule is not a new rule. The citation is TAC Chapter 228.1a. It has been in TAC for a good bit of time, at least since 1999. It is placed on this slide to remind us of the collaboration that needs to happen between stakeholders. Unless stated otherwise, the rules in Chapter 228 will be effective for candidates admitted after 12/27/2016. For your reference, this effective date is found in TAC Chapter 228.60. I have placed other dates on those rules that fall outside this implementation date. I will point those out as I go through the slides. At the beginning of the Chapter 227 information, I identified some key definitions. The definition of a candidate as someone who is formally in your program will be important to keep in mind as we are going over the Chapter 228 rules, since many of these refer to the coursework and training provided to candidates. Of importance here also are the definitions for cooperating teachers, which are assigned to support clinical teachers, mentor teachers, who are assigned to support intern teachers, and site supervisors, which are assigned to support non-teacher candidates completing practicums. These definitions also detail the expected qualifications for each. Please note the credential requirements for these important people in the candidate training process. Credential requirements for all of these include collaboratively assigning. They are collaboratively assigned by the EPP and the campus administrator. They will have at least 3 years of teaching experience. They will be accomplished educators based on student learning. They will be currently certified in the same certification category or class for non-teacher practicum candidates as the candidates they're supervising. And they will be trained by the EPP within 3 weeks of the assignment to the candidate. As part of the records retention requirement, the EPP must collect documentation that each candidate received a mentor, cooperating teacher, or site supervisor, and that each mentor, cooperating teacher, and site supervisor met the qualification requirements. There is a new figure embedded in TAC Chapter 228.10b1 that provides the types of documentation the EPP would need to collect and retain as evidence the EPP met these requirements. The classes on this slide have always existed, but this slide is included so that everyone is clear about who the rules apply to when they say, for example, and I quote, educators being certified in any class. So for example, a rule that applies to educators seeking initial certification in any certificate class would apply to everyone on this list. Conversely, a rule that applies to candidates seeking initial certification in the classroom teacher certification class would apply to only those candidates in the first bullet on the list, which is the classroom teacher class. Not only are the qualifications more clearly defined, but also the roles of the cooperating teachers, mentor teachers, and site supervisors are also more clearly defined. The roles are: they guide, assist, and support candidates in areas such as planning, classroom management, instruction, assessment, working with parents, obtaining materials, and district policies. They guide, assist, and support candidates during the practicum. They report candidate progress to the candidate's field supervisor. So to meet these requirements for your EPP, think about your cooperating teacher, mentor teacher, and site supervisor training, and think about how your clinical teaching, internship, and practicum experiences are designed. Do you train your cooperating teachers, mentors, and site supervisors in these areas? Do you have a current process for the mentors to report candidate progress to the field supervisors? If your answer to either of these questions is no, then you will need to update your processes in these areas. The field supervisor qualifications have also been more clearly defined. These are summarized on this slide. To see the full verbiage, look at the definition that's in TAC 228.2. Field supervisor credential requirements include at least 3 years of experience in the class being supervised, current certification in the class being supervised, and they must complete a TEA-approved field supervisor training. If the field supervisors are not currently certified, then the field supervisor must hold a minimum of a master's degree in the academic area or field related to the class being supervised, and must comply with the continuing professional education requirements for the class being supervised. So for a field supervisor who is not currently certified, the CPE requirement that must be met is 150 clock hours of continuing professional education in 5 years for a teacher certificate, and 200 clock hours in 5 years for non-teacher classes of certificates. TAC Chapter 232 defines the CPE requirements, including what qualifies for CPE credit. Also more clearly defined in TAC is that a field supervisor cannot be employed at the same school where the candidate being supervised is completing clinical teaching, an internship, or a practicum. Also, the field supervisor for a candidate may not also be that candidate's cooperating teacher, mentor teacher, or site supervisor. Another update in TAC involves the definitions of school day and school year. In 228.2, number 28, a school day is defined as at least 7 hours or 420 minutes, including intermissions and recess. Definition 29 for a school year says that a school year is at least 180 days or 75,600 minutes of instruction for students, if not referring to the school day or year of a particular public or private school. These definitions are important to remember as we look at clinical teaching and internship requirements. Before we move on to governance of the EPP, we can take a few minutes and address some additional questions. Okay, let's move on, and we will take some other questions as we go through. There are a lot of changes in Chapter 228. We will review some, and the rest you will need to review on your own. Please remember that even if we don't cover some rule changes here, the EPP is still responsible for knowing them and for updating program components according to those changes. Okay, let's go back a minute. I found some questions. I'm sorry. So for the previous slides, one of the questions was, do site supervisors need 3 years of teaching experience or 3 years experience in the certification class for which they are providing supervision? The answer to that question is a site supervisor needs to have at least 3 years of experience in the aspects of the certification class being pursued by the candidate. The second question that I found was, please define accomplished based upon student learning for a field supervisor. For that has been a superintendent, assistant superintendent, principal, etc. for my principal program. And the answer to that is the EPP and school district determines accomplished educator. The figure in Chapter 228 provides some examples. Okay. All right, let's move forward then. There are some updates and added definition to the rules on this slide. I urge you to read through these rules, and if you need clarification, contact your program specialist for guidance. I am highlighting this portion of the approval rule because it is often used by EPPs. We receive many applications from EPPs across the state to add certification categories, classes, and routes to their inventory. It is important that when the EPP submits an application, it is the newest version. Rules change, and with them, all of our applications and other documents change. Submitting an application on an old form almost always slows down the review and approval process, which is already at least 6 to 8 weeks to add a new certification category from the time we receive the application. For addition of classes and routes, this timing may be 6 to 12 months because these are longer applications and must be approved by the SBAC. It is important to remember that even though your EPP may require a passed PACT pre-admission content test for admission, the EPP is still expected to weave the skill standards for each of the certification categories into their curriculum. So for example, if a candidate is seeking certification in Math 7 through 12, the EPP must provide content methodology coursework and training to ensure that the candidate will be an effective secondary math teacher. If a candidate is seeking certification in core subjects EC6, the EPP should provide content methodology coursework and training to ensure that the candidate will be an effective elementary level generalist. Some of the PPR curriculum would be the same for
I love these mints, but the bad thing is I can't suck on them because I love this sauce. So they're gone in about that long. When they hit my mouth, I gotta stand up.
Meeting with John Wilson this afternoon. Or is it
Thursday.
Thursday? Well, and I don't know how they're admitting. I know that they're trying to get that doctoral program off.
Doing. See if I can find. Long time ago. And John never responded, and I didn't because it was not to me.
Talking. I'm just we're still connected.
Yeah, here it is. John, attached, please find commentary from the head of one of our Texas Dean's group. He monitors aspect meetings in Austin, and he's never even been to one of those. Will you work with Chris to see what we can learn with respect to the prospect of a principal survey? That's what we're meaning.
I think they're having some technical difficulties.
Muted.
Can raise your hand if you can hear me now, please. All right, so raise your hand if you can hear me. Oh, yay. I'm so sorry. I was sitting here talking and I just got muted. So we're going to go ahead and start back again. I apologize for that. So we were talking about the addition of certificate categories and classes, and I was giving you an example about what should be included in the application to add those certificates. So just to wrap up, some of the PPR curriculum, well, I'm going to start over with that because I don't know how much everyone heard. So it's important to remember that even though your EPP may require a passed PACT test for admission, the EPP is still expected to weave the skill standards for each of the certificate categories into their curriculum. So for example, if a candidate is seeking certification in Math 7 through 12, the EPP must provide content methodology coursework and training to ensure that the candidate will be an effective secondary math teacher. If a candidate is seeking certification in core subjects EC6, the EPP should provide content methodology coursework and training to ensure that the candidate will be an effective elementary level generalist. Some of the PPR curriculum would be the same for both of these certificate categories, but then some of the curriculum would be different because there is a distinct difference between being an elementary math teacher and a secondary math teacher. When submitting your application, please read the rules and requirements on that application carefully and fully complete all required portions. We identify governance of the EPP as component 1. There are a few updates to that part of Chapter 228. The advisory committee shall meet a minimum of 1 time during each academic year, and EPP must implement and publish a program calendar or timeline that contains the admission deadline and that allows adequate time for candidates to complete all requirements. A note about advisory committees. If the EPP has one advisory committee representing the entire entity, then that advisory committee must discuss the design, delivery, evaluation, and major policy decisions of every program within that entity number. For some of the larger programs, you do have the option of creating several different advisory committees that address the needs of one or more unique groups within the entity. Remember the slide we discussed in the admission part that requires the EPP to post admission and program completion requirements? The timeline identified in G on the slide could be used for this purpose if worded correctly. Note the requirement that the timeline must allow adequate time for the candidate to complete all requirements. If your EPP has rolling admission, creating a timeline or calendar that meets this requirement will require some creative thought. Component 3 addresses the curriculum requirements. These are found in TAC Chapter 228.30. The requirement for an EPP to offer a curriculum that is based on the Educator Standards is not a new one. This slide is included here as a reminder that the EPP curriculum must be standards-based and also shows where to find those standards. The Educator Standards in PDF form can be found on the TEA website on the Approved Educator Standards page. These are screenshots on this slide of that page and also of the cover page of one of the sets of standards. The blue certificate names on the first 2 screenshots at left are links to the standards for that certificate. When you select a link for Life Science 7 through 12, for example, you would open a document that looks like the 3rd screenshot at right, which contains the Life Science 7 through 12 standards. All teacher candidates must receive instruction in the following standards. Number 1, the content area standards for that certification category. That would be knowledge and or skills indicators depending on the PACT requirement for that program. Number 2, PPR EC through 12 standards. and number 3, the Technology EC through 12 standards number 1 through 7 that are identified for all teachers. For programs that want to conduct a curriculum alignment for a certification category or class, or who want to apply to add a certificate category or class to the EPP inventory, TEA can provide you with handy alignment charts for each certification category or class. To request an alignment chart, please contact your assigned program specialist. TAC requires that all candidates receive instruction in the following: Texas Educators Code of Ethics. Those are found in TAC Chapter 247. Detection and education of students with dyslexia. The citation for that, for your reference, is in Texas Education Code, Chapter 21.044. Mental health, substance abuse, and youth suicide. That citation also takes you to Texas Education Code, Chapter 21. The skills that educators are required to possess, the responsibilities that educators are required to accept, and the high expectations for students in this state. That's again in Texas Education Code. The importance of building strong classroom management skills, and the framework in the state for teacher and principal evaluation. The citations for those two are also in Texas Education Code. Note that dyslexia training has been developed by TEA and Region 10. This training meets the minimum requirements for dyslexia training. If you want your candidates to complete this training, you can access the training via a link on the Program Provider Resources page on the TEA website. The modules for the dyslexia training have many resources, quizzes, and offer a certificate of completion. If your EPP chooses to develop your own in-house dyslexia training, that training must meet the minimum requirements identified in the Texas Administrative Code. Please see the specific rule for those requirements. The mental health, substance abuse, and youth suicide training must be provided by one of the approved providers. To use your own in-house training, the EPP would need to become an approved provider. The TEA does not approve providers. EPPs may access provider information via the TEA website. In addition to the educator standards for each certificate and the requirements on the previous slide, teacher candidates must also receive instruction in relevant TEKS, including the English Language Proficiency Standards, in reading instruction, including instruction that improves students' content area literacy, and for certificates that include early childhood and pre-kindergarten, the pre-kindergarten guidelines, and the skills and competencies captured in the Texas Teacher Standards found in Texas Administrative Code Chapter 149 in Subchapter AA. In addition to the training requirements mentioned for all educator candidates in any class, and the educator standards for the principal certificate, the principal candidate must also receive instruction in the Administrator Standards and Commissioner's Rule in Texas Administrative Code Chapter 149. We have alignment charts for these two. Before we continue to the program design and delivery portion, let's take a few minutes to answer some questions that were submitted during this section of the presentation. Please remember that if we do not get to your question now or at the end of the webinar today, there will be other opportunities in various formats to have those questions answered. Okay, scrolling through the questions. Okay, here is a question. If a post-bac intern in a small district is the only teacher in that category, for example, an ag teacher, who can fulfill the role as the mentor teacher? So the answer to that question would be If an individual who meets the certification category and/or experience criteria for cooperating teacher, mentor, or site supervisor is not available, the EPP and campus or district administrator shall assign an individual who most closely meets the criteria and who most closely meets the criteria. And then you would document the reason for selecting that individual that does not meet the criteria. And the reference for that is in TAC chapter 228.35, little f. Okay, so one more question. This question says, will principal K through 12 suffice for supervising varying candidates? If someone is a certified principal, does that count for field supervision? For example, if someone has been a principal and a former science teacher, could he or she supervise a math teacher? Okay, so the answer to that is a field supervisor with experience as a principal and who holds a current certificate that is appropriate for a principal assignment may supervise principal, classroom teacher, master teacher, and reading specialist candidates. That detail can be found in TAC chapter 228.2, item 16 in the definitions. Okay, let's move forward. This next component, which we call component 4, has to do with the design and delivery of your coursework and training. Coursework and/or training shall be sustained, rigorous, intensive, interactive, candidate-focused, and performance-based. This is not new. The citation for this rule is TAC, chapter 228.35, A2. This slide is included here as a reminder, and it sets the expectation for the quality of training that candidates should be receiving from all EPPs. So undergraduate, post-bac, and ACP candidates in those routes, including face-to-face and online delivery, all should receive the same quality of preparation. If part or all of your coursework is online, then this slide is for you. This new rule states that coursework and training offered online must meet, or EPP must be making progress toward meeting, criteria set for accreditation, quality assurance, and/or compliance with one or more of the following: accreditation by the Distance Education Accrediting Commission, program design and teaching support by Quality Matters, Chapter 4, Subchapter P, relating to approval of distance education courses and programs for public institutions, or Chapter 7, relating to degree granting colleges and universities other than Texas public institutions. So this rule requires the EPP to meet quality standards for online programs and allows for some transition time by saying, and I quote, or EPP must be making progress toward meeting. Keep in mind, though, that making progress will eventually have a finite endpoint. The 4 options on this slide are the only options at this point. The requirement that some training must be completed prior to clinical teaching or internship is not new. What is new is that the requirement has changed from 110 hours to 180 hours. So prior to the rule change, a teacher candidate had to complete a minimum of 80 clock hours of coursework and 30 clock hours of field-based experience before that candidate could begin a clinical teaching or internship assignment. The new change, effective for candidates admitted after the effective date of December 27, 2016, requires the candidate to have completed a minimum of 150 clock hours of coursework and 30 clock hours of FBE, field-based experience. An additional change is that the content of those 150 hours is now more defined. This slide reflects a summary of the prescribed content requirements. Please read the rule text in TAC Chapter 228.35b to find the exact requirements. For candidates admitted after December 27, 2016, the clinical teaching requirement has been increased to a minimum of 14 weeks of full day or 28 weeks of half day. So please think for a minute about the definition of full day that I introduced on an earlier slide. Candidates completing clinical teaching for 14 weeks must be in the classroom each day for at least 7 hours or 420 minutes to meet this certification requirement. The internship is still one full school year. New rules allow a candidate to complete an internship in more than one certification category as long as the EPP provides the relevant coursework and training and also provides field supervision as prescribed for both categories. An update in this rule also allows an EPP to apply for a candidate to complete clinical teaching, an internship, or a practicum out of state or out of country. Please note there is now a $500 application fee for each application, and the review time is between 6 to 8 weeks. The approval must be given by TEA prior to the candidate beginning the out-of-state experience. Also, please note that the application submitted must be the recent version, which may be requested from the assigned program specialist, must be completed according to the instructions, and the rationale for the out-of-state placement must be one of those provided on the application. This is a new rule that requires candidates to experience a full range of professional responsibilities, including the start of the school year, which has been defined as the first 15 days of school. So think for a minute about your FBE requirements and about the structure of your clinical teaching experience. Do clinical teaching candidates get some experience with the first of the school year? If the answer to that question is no, then you will need to update your requirements so that candidates get those experiences. There are new observation requirements for clinical teachers, intern teachers, and candidates completing a practicum. EPP staff should read the related rules about field supervision in TAC Chapter 228.35 carefully to understand the full extent of these changes. For example, clinical teachers must still receive a minimum of 3 formal observations conducted by the field supervisor. However, they must now be spaced apart, 1 observation in each third of the 14-week assignment. Please note that candidates completing the 28 weeks of half days option must now receive a minimum of 4 formal observations. Field supervision for intern teachers has changed also. This can be a bit confusing because the frequency of observations is based on the teaching assignments, the type of certificate the candidate has been issued, and if the candidate has already completed a successful internship. Now would be a good time for us to talk about the new requirements for intern and probationary certificates so that we can better understand the field supervision requirements in this rule. A candidate may still serve for up to 3 years as a teacher in a classroom without a standard teaching certificate. Effective September 1st, 2017, an EPP may recommend either an intern certificate or a probationary certificate to a candidate completing an internship. An intern must have either an intern certificate or a probationary certificate during the time of the internship for that internship to be considered valid. even if the candidate is teaching at an approved private or charter school that does not usually require a teacher to be certified. The intern certificate is issued to a candidate who has passed only the content test and any supplemental tests required for the certificate. The intern certificate is effective for 1 year. If a candidate needs an additional internship year, then he or she would be placed on a probationary certificate for that second year and or third year. To qualify for a probationary certificate, a candidate must have passed all relevant certification exams, including the PPR EC through 12. So now let's go back to the rule on the slide. A candidate with an intern certificate would be required to receive 5 formal observations by the field supervisor, 3 observations during the first half of the assignment, and 2 during the second half. The rules now allow for candidates to be certified in more than one certification category as long as they are prepared appropriately for each and have an opportunity to practice the skills for both in the internship. Candidates serving on concurrent intern certificates must have all relevant content and supplemental tests passed for both certificates and must receive 6 formal observations, 3 observations in each content area. Note the candidate must complete at least 4 hours in the subject area appropriate for that certificate. A probationary certificate may be extended only once after the first one. Candidates completing an internship with a probationary certificate must have all relevant tests passed and must receive a minimum of 3 observations, spaced out 1 in each third of the assignment. The observations for all candidates are spaced out for the purpose of allowing candidates an opportunity to show growth between observations. Candidates on concurrent probationary certificates will receive a minimum of 4 observations, 2 observations in each content area, again spaced out to allow a candidate to grow as a teacher. The new rules also specify requirements for a candidate to complete a second internship year. The second year would be needed if it was determined that the first year was unsuccessful, or if the candidate still had EPP coursework or training requirements to complete. For candidates who were unsuccessful in the first internship year, the EPP would work with the candidate to develop and implement a deficiency plan for the second internship year. Candidates completing additional internship years must receive the required field supervision as identified on this slide. From September 1st, 2017 and beyond, the system will not issue an intern certificate or a probationary certificate if it does not find the related past exams, similar to the way the standard certificate won't issue now without the relevant test passed. This will be important to remember for candidates serving in an internship on an intern certificate. If the PPR EC through 12 test is not passed, the candidate will not be eligible to receive a probationary certificate if necessary for a second internship year, and as a result, could lose the teaching contract from the district. This is also important for candidates serving in an internship on an intern certificate that expect to receive a standard certificate at the completion of the internship year. If the PPR EC through 12 test is not passed, the candidate will not be eligible to receive the standard certificate or a probationary certificate, and as a result could lose the teaching contract from the district. Remember the rule that requires the EPP to post a timeline or calendar of requirements for EPP admission and completion. Perhaps consider building into that timeline a benchmark that requires the candidate to challenge the PPR EC through 12 exam early in the internship year. Non-teacher candidates are still required to complete a 160 clock-hour standards-based practicum. They are also still required to receive a minimum of 3 formal observations conducted by the field supervisor for a total of 135 minutes or more. The notable changes in this requirement are, first, at least one of the formal observations must be conducted face-to-face on-site where the practicum is being completed, and second, the observations must be spaced out, 1 in each third of the practicum. All field supervision now requires a process that includes a pre-conference, the observation, and a post-conference. Relevant training will be developed by the state for all field supervisors. The TEA is currently working with a vendor to develop the field supervisor training. More information will be provided to you as we have a better idea of the launch date for that training, which should be later this spring. We have heard some concerns that this field supervisor training will require field supervisors to use a statewide observation tool. This is not true. The EPP may still use its own observation tool. An EPP shall retain documents that evidence a candidate's eligibility for admission to the program and evidence of completion of all program requirements for a period of 5 years after a candidate completes, withdraws from, or is discharged or released from the program. This is the records retention rule and is not new. As a person who has reviewed EPP documentation, I have observed that often EPP staff do not know what is the appropriate documentation to retain as evidence of candidate admission and completion. The figure on the next slide will provide some guidance on collecting documentation. This figure is embedded in Chapter 228 and helps the EPP to identify the appropriate types of documentation that would fulfill the records retention requirement. The information in this figure also helps the EPP staff to know what kinds of documentation TEA would expect to see as evidence of compliance with TAC during a program review. To read the document, note there is a summary of the rules in the left column. In the right column is the evidence or documentation that the EPP would collect and retain in candidate records or in EPP records. These rules on this slide are about program evaluation and candidate assessment and are found in TAC Chapter 228.40. They are not really new, just updated. Previous rules were interpreted this way, but the wording has now been clarified to make rules more clear. First, the EPP is responsible for preparing candidates for certification exams unless the candidate passes appropriate content certification exams prior to admission. Second, the EPP may prepare a candidate for a certificate category other than the one for which the candidate was admitted upon written request by the candidate. Third, EPP shall not grant certification exam approval until the candidate has been contingently or formally admitted. And fourth, the EPP must continuously evaluate all program components. Before we continue to the last section, let's take a few minutes to address some of the questions that were submitted during this section. So if you'll just give me a minute to read through the questions. Okay, so here's one. 14 weeks for clinical teaching applies only to those admitted after 12/27/16. Is this correct? The answer is yes. The new clinical teaching requirements apply to candidates admitted on or after December 27, 2016. Okay, here's another one. Question. If a candidate has passed all certification exams, including the PPR, are they required to have an intern certificate, or can they be issued a probationary without having an internship certificate? And the answer to that is, if a candidate meets all of the requirements of a probationary certificate can be issued for a first-year internship. Okay. There are numerous changes in Chapter 230 regarding certificates and certification. Please refer to TAC Chapter 230 to find specific detail. For example, a significant change is for an educator who possesses a standard teaching certificate but wants to add a CTE certificate that requires licensure and work experience. These certificates can now be added through the certification by exam route and no longer require an educator with a standard certificate to complete additional coursework or internship with an EPP. This process may be handled in one of two ways. A, either the educator works with an EPP for the license and credential review and receives test approval from that EPP, or B, the candidate works with the school district where personnel may conduct the credential review and then TEA would grant test approval for the relevant exam. In both cases, the educator would ultimately contact TEA directly to add the certificate. More information about this process can be found on the TEA website by selecting Additional Certifications from the Texas Educators drop-down menu. Once on that page, select Additional Certification by Exam for certificates requiring work experience. If you are approached by educators to add a CTE certificate by exam, please encourage them to go to this page for information. On the previous slide, we just talked about the rule change that allows an educator with a standard certificate to add a CTE certificate that requires licensure and work experience through the cert by exam route. We also identified that the educator could seek the assistance of an EPP or the school district to review credentials. If the EPP assists one of these educators in this process, you would give test approval after you verify the credentials. When giving test approval, you would go into the green screen as you would to give a candidate test approval and search for that educator. You would then select the route that says SOQ Verified Certification by Exam, which is identified on this slide by the red arrow, and then select the appropriate test and then approve the test. Remember, this route for test approval should only be used for an educator who already has a standard certificate and has the appropriate licensure and work experience. The EPP is not accountable for tests passed or failed in this route. Certification has a new process for submitting questions and requesting assistance. To access the Help Desk option, EPPs and candidates should go to the TEA homepage and click on the Texas Educators tab. On the resulting page, shown in the screenshot on this slide, the EPP or candidate will then select the Help Desk icon on the right side of the page. On the page that says Welcome to the TEA Help Desk, select the Texas Educators option. On the Texas Educators page, select Submit a Request. The information should be completed in this ticket form. Appropriate requests are listed on this screen. If documents need to be uploaded, that can happen here too. Then select Submit in the bottom right corner. It's an easy process and tickets are processed promptly. Please share this with candidates as necessary. This slide is a summary that revisits the disclaimer at the beginning of the training. We want to reiterate that this webinar training is not comprehensive for all of the changes and updates you will find in the Texas Administrative Code. You are encouraged to review the relevant chapters, especially 227, 228, 229, and 230, to find the details of all of the changes. Your assigned program specialist is here to assist if clarification is needed on any of the rules. Once again, the program specialist assignments are posted on the Program Providers Resources page on the TEA website. However, if your assigned specialist is not available, it is acceptable to call another one. At this time, we will answer some more questions that were submitted during the last section of the presentation. As time allows, we will also answer other questions that were submitted throughout the presentation. We will post this webinar for you to view again. We will also send a notice when we've scheduled the follow-up Q&A webinars. Let's just take a minute for me to look over some of the questions. Okay, here's a question. Does documentation have to be in paper form or we keep it in electronic form? May the charts documentation of curriculum be online or in a database, or must they all be paper documents? And the answer to that is documentation may be kept in paper or electronic form. Second question. Can a candidate on an intern certificate be a teacher of record on a school campus? Yes. The answer is yes. An intern with a valid intern certificate can be a teacher of record for the appropriate assignment. Okay, here's another one. When you say that a program may approve for an exam in an area other than that the candidate was admitted for upon written request, is that a requirement or is that a TEA decision? Okay, the answer is that the decision to approve an exam in an area other than that the candidate was admitted is an EPP decision. The candidate must request it, but the EPP makes the decision on preparation and test approval. Okay. Okay. Okay, so there are a lot of questions on here, and some of them we're going to need to get other departments to weigh in on because they don't all pertain to just this particular area. So for now, I wanted to remind you that we will post this webinar. We will also hold a question and answer session on another webinar. And then feel free to contact your program specialist for answers to the questions. And we will also take these questions, compile them, and publish an FAQ going forward. So this now concludes the webinar. We want to thank you for attending, and we hope you have a wonderful day.